So spoiler alert, but yes, I'm going to be destroying a vintage Donkey Kong plush. The real question is, will I be able to fix it? Because I've got two custom plushes planned that I think will be the first of their kind. At least I'm hoping so by the time this video goes live. And I'm going to be using this vintage plush from 1997 to do that. And this video is actually going to be two projects in one. The first project is because apparently Donkey Kong wears pants now. So I need to do some work to get this guy a little closer to the new design that we're going to see in Donkey Kong Bananza. Don't ask why I have so many, but we are going to be choosing this one. And first I need to make him some overalls.
Okay!
And I'm going to make those out of, you guessed it, jeggings. You did guess jeggings, right? Just me? Before we get into that, let me give you a sneak peek of what Project 2 is going to entail, and honestly, I am pretty nervous about it, but that's for later, so back to the jeggings. So my thought process behind the jeggings is that they obviously have that nice denim color for the overalls, but also they're relatively elastic. And I'll be honest, these aren't what I was expecting when I purchased jeggings. I thought it would be more like leggings and less like jeans, but these are actually pretty much just jeans that are relatively stretchy. And they only stretch in this direction. From this direction, they're pretty taut. So I'll have to be cognizant of that when I am patterning out the overalls, but I think these should work. So basically I am going to take some painter's tape, and with strips of this, I'm going to essentially paint on where I want the overalls to be. Now I can take a really sharp blade and cut down the sides, being really careful not to cut into the plush, and that will end up making the two sides of our pattern. And the adhesive from the tape made it really easy to stick to the plush in the first place, and it also makes it really easy to stick down onto the fabric. And again, I'm making sure to lay this down in a way that will utilize the stretchiness of the fabric, which should make them easier to get onto the plush once I've sewn them together. So then I take this white fabric pen and trace out the pattern onto the fabric. And this ink is really cool because it will come off with a little bit of friction or heat. But it shouldn't be a huge deal because I am putting the pattern down on the inside of the fabric, and you may have noticed that that's the dark side of the jeans. I actually realized that the inside matches the lighter color of the overalls, and the straps are more this darker color, so I'm going to be using the inside of the jeggings for the main body of the overalls. And that leaves me with two halves of the pattern, which I can now cut out and sew together. And if you have any experience with sewing at all, you may have noticed that I didn't add any seam allowance. I'm actually going to be cutting this exactly on the line and then sewing it together just like that, which should make a pair of overalls that is a little smaller than the plush, and that should let me utilize the stretchiness of the fabric to fit it over the plush and have it conform really tightly down to the legs. And then I'm going to hand stitch that together with the outer part of the fabric on the inside. That way I can stitch a nice seam up the sides and then turn it inside out, having those seams remain on the inside. Which looks a little bit like this. And I'm not great at hand stitching, so I know the shape is a little wonky, but again, when it stretches over the legs, it should look pretty good. So now on to the straps. And the straps I actually used a sewing machine for. It was just easier to run these close stitches up this long length. So I made two of them connected together, and now I can cut them in half and then clean up some of these frayed edges. And the best way I found to do that is just by using a little bit of fire. Just a quick touch with a flame and it burns some of those cotton threads and the other stretchy materials. It melts a little bit and it cleans up those edges really nice. And I definitely could have attached these straps with more thread, stitching it together, but it seemed like the easier thing to do would be a little bit of super glue. So just a dab here, holding that in place, and then crossing it over. Easy. And then the final detail for the straps are the silver buttons that hold them together. Originally I was going to punch those out of some thin gauge metal sheet with this hole punch, but when I opened the hole punch I realized that there were actually some offcut circles in here already, and I'm a huge fan of reusing things, so I'm just going to use these as those buttons. Again, just a little bit of super glue should hold those in place just fine.
Okay!
One of the biggest changes to the Donkey Kong design is the general eye shape, opting for a rounder, more open eye that's supposed to be more expressive. So I'm taking a small section of coat hanger wire and opening up just a small stitch on the brow so that I can put that in and reshape it. So here's the original shape of that brow again with the classic Donkey Kong scowl, and then here's that coat hanger wire after I was able to reshape it. So here's the before, and here is the after. And I do think it really changes the vibe of this plush and gets it a lot more in line with the new design, but there's still a lot of work that we need to do on the eyes. Starting with the color, because depending on what source you're looking at for both the previous design and the new one, the color around the eyes can be a few different shades of brown, and I think it's pretty clear that the new design is much darker. Sometimes looking like a very dark brown, but most of the time just coming off as black. So I've actually got some black felt here that I'm cutting to match that eye shape, and I'll be putting that in instead. And then the eyes themselves are much more egg-shaped than they used to be, so I threw together a quick model of that and printed it out. I went ahead and printed out a couple of different pupil sizes because the source material does vary a lot, and I think I like the bigger pupils better, but let me know in the comments which one you like better. Quick note from future Brian though. I actually changed the design of the eyes to be a lot more rounded, and I know that doesn't match the egg shape as well, but it does help fill the eye space a little better. So let me know of all the different eyes which ones you prefer. Okay. Yep, apparently there is a hat too, and of course we are going to sculpt that out in Nomad Sculpt. When I first saw this hat, I originally thought it was kind of like Diddy Kong's hat. It even kind of looked red, but then I found some in-game pictures of what looked to be more of a yellow hat, and then I found this one of an orange hat floating through space, and it appears to be a miner's hat with a light on the front. And since then I found a lot of other footage of this miner's hat. And I'm pretty sure that all the hats I've seen have been this orange one with the light on front. It's just been different lightings, so that's why it looked a little different. But I think this is going to be one of the cosmetics that you can choose to wear, kind of like in Mario Odyssey. This image was a really good reference to sculpt off of. Basically, I recreated the hat to the best of my ability and then that light on the front. And I was able to document every step of the way, so you can see my process on the left. And printing it out was super simple. I opted to print out the light separately so that I didn't waste a bunch of filament with multicolored printing. And then the two pieces are really easily connected just with a little bit of CA glue. You may actually be able to see a little LED peeking out of the hole there just briefly. And that's because I was actually able to dismantle one of the battery operated tea lights that you can get for pretty cheap and hide that simple circuit inside of the hat. That way I can turn on that light, which was completely unnecessary, but I do think adds a lot to this hat. Okay. There's actually not too much to do for the tie, but for some reason these BDNA plushes used a plain white logo for the tie, which I don't think was ever really a part of Donkey Kong's design. They tend to opt for that classic yellow and red logo, and I'm going to add that to make it look a little more accurate. So you see that I've already designed that in Procreate and had it cut out on my Cricut vinyl cutter. And I actually had to do this process a second time for project number 2, but that actually uses a slightly different method. I had to go with this yellow blob for this version to cover up that white logo, and you'll see why that wasn't necessary on the second project. But I'm pretty happy with how the logo came out on this one. Okay. Not too much to say about this one. I sculpted odd rock, printed it out, and then threw some paint on it. Sculpting facets into the rock ended up being harder than I thought it would be, but we got it done. And here's the before and after of the crude paint job that I put on. And this was before I learned that odd rock is really just Pauline, and it's unlikely that we're going to see odd rock in this form very much in the game, but it's still a really cool design, and I'm not upset that I made it. And that is the final update that I had planned, so I present to you the world's first Donkey Kong Bananza plush. Here we go. So they're finally here, performing for you. If you know the words, you can join in too. Put your hands together if you want to clap as we take you through this monkey rap. Part 2 is making a custom Super Kong plush. Why? I just want to. Growing up, I always thought it was a good idea. I mean, you have Saiyans and Super Saiyans. You've got Sonic and Super Sonic. I thought, why not Kong, Super Kong? And then they made one. I think it was for Donkey Kong Country Returns on the Wii. And I really like the design, and I don't think a plush of it exists. So we're going to make the world's first Super Kong plush as well. So here's the setup, and we've got the reference piece and then the sacrificial plush. And you can see that I've started by dismantling this plush, at least half of it. And I did that by using a seam ripper and just going along each seam and cutting it off so that I could take the individual panels of this pattern. And I'm leaving this side intact just so that I can reference how everything goes together, but eventually I will take that apart because I'm going to be using these tan sections over again. The hands and feet, the chest, and then these face parts. Hopefully I can reuse those so that I don't have to pattern those out again. But basically I have these pattern pieces and I've stuck them to some duct tape because they actually curl up pretty significantly around the seam allowance. So it's hard to get an accurate recreation of this piece. So I've been sticking those down to tape so that I can cut them out really close and keep that seam allowance. Then I'll take these pattern pieces and transfer it over to some white fabric. And we've got a couple of options here. I've got one that is pretty similar to the actual fabric used in the plush. Fairly thin, should be relatively easy to work with. And this will be my backup fabric. But I also have this one that has a little bit of a nap to it. A pile, I think they call it, which is just this raised fur texture. So it's quite a bit thicker, and I think it's going to be harder to work with. Probably not wise to start with this as my kind of first foray into plush making, but I think this will give a really nice fur texture on the Super Kong. So I'm going to try this first, and if I can't seem to make it work, then I'll move on to the easier fabric, which I still don't know if I'll be able to make work, but we've got options. And then I've got this blue fabric here to recreate the tie. Not too much of that, but I shouldn't need much. And then we'll make a vinyl sticker for that as well. And then some various odds and ends. Some fabric pens that wipe off with, or rub off rather, with friction. I think any heat will remove those. So that should help me with the patterning. Some various needles and pins. And I'm going to, I think, mostly do hand sewing for this, although I'll try to use a sewing machine for some of it. I think a lot of these lines might be a little too delicate to get in there with a sewing machine. So we'll see what we can do. I've got a couple of panels here that also have this thread running through the center, and that's to make, I guess, the different musculature demarcations so that these are one panel. So there's some stuff I'll need to figure out, play around with. I think it's going to be pretty tough, but we'll see what we can do. So the duct tape serves two functions, not just holding down the curved edges of the seam allowance, which is really important, but also adding some much needed rigidity. After I cut it out, that makes it a lot easier to trace onto the other fabric. And again, I'm using the same fabric pens that rub away with friction, but this time I'm using a dark one for the lighter fabric. Once all of those are fully traced out, I can get to cutting them out, and this was no problem. It was just a little frustrating because that pile, that nap of the fur on the back side, would come apart when you cut through it, so I was left with all these little tufts of white fur that got everywhere, but not too bad. So I've got a couple of those leg sections haphazardly pinned together, and I'll adjust these as I go, but notably they are inside out so that we can flip them right side right when the seam is down and hide that seam on the inside. I'm going to try this section on the sewing machine, although I don't have a ton of experience. I do think this outer curve will be decent enough to do on the machine, so we'll see how that goes. And just to get ahead of some potential comments, my fingers are not actually getting that close to the sewing needle. I know it looks like they are, and it looks pretty dangerous, but all is good. That went all right. Not the prettiest thing in the world, but I think it's strong. And you can see then when I turn it inside out, this is that knee section here. And I think it matches that curve really well. So we are going to continue on, leaving the foothold open so that I can hand stitch the feet on. It'll be like this. So that's the general idea. General idea? Keep going on like that with all the pattern pieces and keep as close to those seams as I can get. Took a couple of tries, but I did get that inner curve looking good as well. And I do know that there is a thread cutter in the back of the machine, but it's just easier to use a craft knife sometimes. Next up is the shoulder section, which has this dart cutout that's supposed to be joined together and help create that kind of rounded shoulder look. So we'll hand stitch that first, and then I can sew this to the other arm panel. And really, I'm making this harder than it should be, trying to get a good camera shot. It's a lot easier to use a sewing machine when you don't have to worry about your hands being in the way, but it is what it is. So now it's time to consider this inner seam, now that we have both of those panels attached on one side. So I'm transferring that over roughly with the fabric pen, and then I'm going to run a couple of stitches up that line. And although this went smoothly, I was not at all happy with how it ended up looking. I don't know if I didn't get the stitches close enough together, but you can clearly see two lines, which is not how it's supposed to look. So I actually took a seam ripper to one of those lines to get us back down to one. So on the left here is one line, and on the right is two. And I think the one line looks a lot better, so we're going with that. With that muscle demarcation being in place, now I can sew up the other side and get a full arm, which looks a little bit like this. And I gotta say, I'm happy with how this came out. Looks pretty good. So we're moving on to hand sewing for some of these more delicate connections. And I need to attach this back panel to the leg piece. And it essentially goes like this, inside out, of course, where this point needs to come about halfway down the circle. And then this edge follows up here and around and will eventually connect over here. And then when it's inverted, you have the fur will be exposed on both ends. The problem is that this curve is smaller than this curve. So while I'm going, I have to start from here and end here. I need to crinkle this in a way that shortens that distance and creates a little bit of a crimp in the material. And what that does is it gives this rounded section for the back cheek, if you will. So I'm going to do that by hand and probably just start by stitching it over here, stitching it over here, and then I'll just kind of bunch it up as I continue to hand sew along. And then this piece kind of goes in between the chest muscle, the pec here, and the arm, and then it also connects to that back piece right here. So I'll have to work that into part of this back panel and have that be one solid piece in through here so that I can put the chest on later. So that's the plan for right now, and honestly, I'm not great at hand sewing, but we're going to see what we can do. So here are the panels for the head disassembled. You can see I have left and right brows, the side of the head that wraps around to the back. These are actually the ear holes, and I'm not going to include the ear holes. I think it'll be easy just to stitch the ears on after the fact over the top. So that's what I'm going to do there. And then the hair tuft is actually two panels front and back rather than left and right. And I've made the decision to cut this section off, which is that classic hook of these BD&A plushes. And I think cutting that hook off will make it not only easier to sew, but I think it'll look nicer to just have kind of a curved triangle for that hair tuft. So that's what we're going with. So I'm just at work here with my Diet Dr. Pepper, and I was doing some hand sewing while I had some downtime. And from the inside it looks good, but I did screw up, and I like documenting my mistakes. So I did want to just film for a second and show that. Like I said, it looks fine from this side, but when you flip that head section back around, you can see that there's that large seam there of the thread, and that's because on the reverse I matched the back of the fabric to the back of the fabric and sewed them together when I should have matched the fur side to the fur side. That way when it reflips right side out, that seam is on the inside rather than the outside. So I'm going to have to take a seam ripper to this and take that little hair tuft piece off and do it again, but it happens. Okay, that looks much better, and you can see I did it all the way around. Definitely worth doing, and now I can start to put it up against the face and start to get a picture of what the final thing's going to look like. And I gotta say, pretty stoked about it. Let's keep going. So now I can take the two arm sockets and join those together. And then from the inside here, I can grab these two edges and then run a seam along this edge and then this edge on the other side. And that should connect the arm to the body. Okay, that went pretty well. Got a nice strong stitch, and I think it looks pretty decent. Plus you can still access it to put in the stuffing and the beans, and you get that muscle demarcation, which I think looks pretty good. And you can start to see with the other half how things start to fit together with this piece connecting here and at the pec, and then the abdomen and stomach section coming down here connecting to the leg. And then you have the foot. This one's the foot, and the hand, kind of like that. And then that wraps under, head goes here. So, starting to come together. I was a little concerned flipping this over when I noticed that the back has this curve to it. And you don't notice a curve in the back when you have an actual plush. It's just a straight line up. And I think it might be because of this slight hump here that accounts for that curve. But either way, I think it's supposed to be like that, since on this version, which was the normal plush, you have a very similar curve going in the opposite direction. It's easier to see when you hold it up a little bit, so that curve comes over. And when you have them side by side, it looks like those back pieces wouldn't join up, but I think they join up and kind of form that hump. So I think we're moving along pretty well. I think I'm going to go ahead and do a Frankenstein thing and join these two together, because I'm going to be reusing this for the Super Kong anyway. I just refrained from disconnecting this side so I could use this as a reference, but now that I'm going to have to disconnect it, might as well get some fun out of it first. We'll see how that goes. Okay, this is pretty cool. Obviously no hands or feet. I haven't connected the bottom of the abdomen here because that kind of connects in a point underneath in a triangle here, so no sense in doing that until I have the other side complete, and then it's also open in the back again because nothing to connect it to. But I think this gives a pretty good idea of what the final plush might look like, and it's looking pretty good so far. I mean, it's not perfect, but I think that's going to look really good. So I'm going to take this other side off, and then I'll go through these same steps to create this other half, and then put it all together. I've already got the head waiting in the wings, just waiting for the final reveal. We'll hold off on that one for a little bit, but really happy with this progress. Let's keep going. Okay, all of the flesh-colored pieces have been removed, so now I just need to recreate this section in the white fabric. Fortunately, I know a trick for that. Really, all you have to do is... and it's done. Now I can go ahead and put on the right hand and foot, and that starts by shoving all this stuffing into the leg. Then I can use a stitch called a ladder stitch, which is great for repairing plushes, but also for any type of seam that you want to be hidden without being able to access the inside and then flip it inside out. So since these legs are attached and I can't really do that, I'm using the ladder stitch here, which works really well. After which I can put all of the stuffing in bean bags back into the arm and leg. At this point you can see that I have both hands, both feet, and the head attached. I have most of the stuffing in and I'm just closing up the back. So before I do that, before I forget, I'm going to put in the last major bean bag and then I can finish this stitch up. And this is just one final ladder stitch all the way up the back seam to close it all up. Just checking to make sure that all the seams are nice and strong. And yeah, now that it's all together, those back panels came together really nicely. No curves at all and not even much of a hump. Now the only thing we're missing is the tie, and it goes together in much the same way. The only thing to note is that the vinyl sticker only needs the yellow parts. I didn't even buy any blue vinyl at all because the fabric of the tie will serve that purpose. So I'm going to make that real quick, and it looks a little something like this. And with that, project 2 comes to a close, the world's first FrankenKong plush.
He's the leader of the bunch. You know him well. He's finally back to kick some tail. His coconut gun can fire in spurts. If he shoots ya, it's gonna hurt. He's bigger, faster, and stronger.
Well, there you have it, 2 custom Donkey Kong plushes, and I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with how they both came out. This was quite outside of my comfort zone, so I really appreciate you making it to the end of the video and for joining me on this process while I kind of navigate this world of sewing a plush. I really like the new Donkey Kong design, and I figured with Bananza coming out soon, it would be a good opportunity to make the very first plush. And though less topical, the Super Kong plush has actually been on the big list of projects for years. So we can go ahead and check that one off. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more projects just like these. If you want any of my 3D models like Odd Rock or the hat or the eyes for whatever reason, or the Macau guitar or crab bass from previous videos, go ahead and check out my channel memberships because there is a tier for those. And if you just want to support the channel, there might be a better tier for that. And huge shout out to new members Andrew House and Thomas Computes. It means the world to me, and your support is going to help me to continue making really awesome videos and projects. Until next time, I've got some big things planned, so stay tuned. Peace.
She can make Donkey Kong transform.
Man, that looks cool.
With it.
Let me know if you want me to make it. Oh snap, you made it to the end. Hopefully that means you enjoyed. If so, click the circle to subscribe. And you might also like this other video. I'm making a guitar from Majora's Mask.